In the frozen twilight of the Cold War, a monster prowled the plains of Eastern Europe that made NATO commanders wake sweating in the night. The Soviet T-72 main battle tank wasn't just another armored vehicle. It was a steel predator that embodied everything Western military analysts feared about the Red Army's overwhelming numerical superiority. Intelligence photographs showed thousands of these machines lined up in Warsaw-packed staging areas, their low silhouettes and powerful guns representing a tidal wave that could potentially sweep across West Germany in mere days. The T-72 had earned a reputation as practically invincible, a technological marvel that Soviet propaganda celebrated, while Western intelligence agencies desperately tried to understand. Every NATO wargame throughout the late 70s painted the same terrifying picture: waves of T-72s breaking through defensive lines, their armor shrugging off anti-tank weapons, their crews protected by revolutionary composite armor that Western engineers could only theorize about. Military planners calculated that stopping a full-scale Soviet armored offensive would require tactical nuclear weapons, a threshold no one wanted to cross. This wasn't just about tanks, it was about the balance of power that kept an uneasy peace across a divided continent. The strategic calculus of tank warfare had become an obsession for both superpowers, each measuring their strength in tons of armor plate and millimeters of gun caliber. American tankers trained in their M60 patterns and early Abrams knew they were qualitatively superior to their Soviet counterparts in crew training and sophisticated fire control systems. But numbers told a darker story. For every American tank in Europe, the Soviets could field 5 or 6 T-72s, and in armored warfare, quantity had a quality all its own. The T-72 represented a different philosophy of war, one that accepted higher casualties in exchange for overwhelming force and rapid production. Western observers noted its simple, brutal efficiency, a tank designed not in comfortable research facilities, but in the harsh reality of Soviet industrial capability and the memory of massive tank battles across the Eastern Front. The question that haunted Pentagon briefing rooms wasn't whether American tanks were better, it was whether being better would matter when facing such crushing numerical odds. Every intelligence report, every grainy satellite image, every whispered rumor from behind the Iron Curtain added another piece to a puzzle that Western military minds desperately needed to solve before the shooting started. The autumn of 1982 brought a chill to the intelligence community that had nothing to do with the weather. In a nondescript office, building in Langley, Virginia, men in dark suits gathered around conference tables covered with reconnaissance photographs, their faces drawn with the exhaustion of those fighting an invisible war. The mission parameters were simple to state, but nearly impossible to execute. Obtain detailed intelligence on the T-72's internal systems, particularly its engine and armor composition, by any means necessary. CIA operatives worked through networks of informants that stretched from Warsaw to Damascus, each thread of information purchased with carefully laundered dollars and the constant risk of exposure. The KGB's counterintelligence apparatus had already rolled up 3 Western spy rings that year, their agents disappearing into the basement cells of Lubyanka prison. Every approach to Soviet military facilities was monitored, every factory worker vetted and surveilled, every piece of equipment guarded with paranoid intensity. Yet the intelligence agencies persisted because the alternative, going to war blind against an enemy whose capabilities remained shrouded in secrecy, was simply unthinkable. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources. A maintenance officer in the Syrian Arab army who had grown disillusioned with Soviet advisors after watching them treat his countrymen with barely concealed contempt. His coded messages arrived through a cutout in Beirut, a businessman who ran legitimate import operations while facilitating the kind of transactions that never appeared in any ledger. The Syrian officer had access to a damaged T-72 that had been withdrawn from frontline service after suffering mechanical failures, sitting in a depot where oversight had grown lax and corruption made the impossible merely expensive. Western intelligence officers debated the offer in marathon sessions that stretched through smoke-filled nights, analyzing every angle for potential traps or disinformation operations. The price wasn't just monetary, it included forged emigration documents, new identities for an extended family, and enough money to start over in a country where Soviet retaliation couldn't reach. Time pressure mounted as the tank could be transferred to a more secure facility at any moment, forcing a decision that could either provide the breakthrough NATO desperately needed or expose an entire intelligence network to devastating compromise. The exfiltration operation required the coordination of 3 intelligence services and more than 24 operatives moving in careful synchronization across international borders. A cargo ship registered in Panama, but quietly owned by a CIA front company, waited in the port of Latakia, its manifest declaring agricultural equipment destined for West Africa. The T-72 had to be disassembled into components small enough to avoid immediate detection, then transported through checkpoints where the wrong question from a suspicious guard could unravel everything. Israeli intelligence provided electronic surveillance capabilities that blinded Syrian radar installations for precisely 93 minutes during the crucial loading phase. The operatives worked in near silence, their training overriding the adrenaline that made hands want to shake and minds want to race ahead to all the catastrophic scenarios. Every metallic clank of the loading equipment echoed across the dock like a bell announcing their presence. Every sweep of distant headlights seemed like the vanguard of security forces converging on their position. $2 million in cash payments disappeared into Syrian bank accounts, leaving no trace beyond the sudden prosperity of a few carefully selected officers whose silence had been purchased at rates that reflected their considerable risk. When the cargo ship cleared international waters, 3 days later, the naval officers responsible for its protection allowed themselves the first full breath they'd taken since the operation began. The T-72 components, packed in crates marked as industrial presses and irrigation equipment, had already become the most valuable Soviet military hardware ever obtained by Western intelligence. A coded transmission reached the Pentagon with just 2 words that sent waves of anticipation through the entire defense establishment. Package delivered. The ship's course took it through the Mediterranean, through the Gibraltar Strait under the watchful escort of submarines that maintained a protective cordon against any Soviet attempt at interception. In Moscow, the GRU would eventually piece together what had happened, but by then the tank would be deep inside a facility so classified that its existence was known to fewer than 200 people in the entire United States government. The chess game between superpowers had just witnessed a move that would reshape the entire board, though neither side yet understood the full implications of what American engineers were about to discover. The crates arrived at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base under cover of darkness, transported in unmarked trucks that had traveled from a naval facility through back roads avoided by civilian traffic. Security personnel formed concentric rings around Building 479, a windowless structure whose interior had been swept for listening devices 3 times in the previous 48 hours, each team operating independently to ensure no single group could compromise the entire operation. Inside, Colonel Richard Thornton stood beside the assembly of engineers and intelligence analysts who represented the finest technical minds the defense establishment could gather on 72 hours' notice. The air smelled of machine oil and anticipation as crowbars bit into wooden slats, revealing components that still bore Cyrillic stenciling and the red star of Soviet manufacture. Thornton watched younger officers lean forward, Unconsciously drawn toward technology they had only studied through grainy satellite photographs and speculative briefings from defectors whose reliability remained perpetually questionable. The engine block emerged first, its cast-iron surface scarred and stained with residue from desert operations that had pushed Soviet metallurgy to its operational limits. The examination began with the methodical precision of surgeons operating on a patient whose survival carried implications beyond a single life. Dr. Elizabeth Garrison, whose MIT doctorate in mechanical engineering masked her deeper role within the Defense Intelligence Agency, circled the disassembled components with instruments that measured tolerances down to microns. Her team photographed every surface from multiple angles, creating documentation so comprehensive that the tank could be virtually reconstructed from the images alone if the physical evidence somehow disappeared. The Soviet engineering philosophy revealed itself in details that seemed almost crude by Western standards, welds that would have failed quality control inspections at any American manufacturer, castings whose tolerances varied in ways that suggested inconsistent industrial processes. Yet the components had functioned, had propelled tons of armor across battlefield conditions that destroyed more sophisticated Western designs, had embodied a pragmatism that prioritized reliability over refinement. Garrison's fingers traced the autoloader mechanism mounting points, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to something approaching concern as she recognized patterns that didn't align with logical engineering practice. General Thomas Whitmore arrived from the Pentagon carrying authorization codes that opened safes containing Israeli intelligence reports from the Bekaa Valley, documents stained with the urgency of men who had faced these machines in combat. The reports described destruction that seemed excessive, even by the violent standards of tank warfare. Entire vehicles consumed by secondary explosions that left nothing but twisted metal and carbon shadows where crews had been. Syrian tank commanders interviewed after defecting spoke in hushed tones about T-72s that bloomed like flowers when penetrated, their turrets launching skyward with such force that they landed dozens of meters from the burning hulls. These accounts had been dismissed initially as propaganda or exaggeration, the kind of war stories that grew with each retelling around campfires and in officers' clubs. But now, with Soviet engineering laid bare under fluorescent lights, patterns began emerging that transformed anecdotes into data points, suggesting a systemic vulnerability. Whitmore spread reconnaissance photographs across a steel table, each image showing the distinctive aftermath of catastrophic ammunition detonations that Western tanks simply did not experience with such regularity. The scientists worked through the night, sustained by coffee that grew progressively more bitter and the electric awareness that they stood at the intersection of engineering analysis and strategic advantage. By dawn, preliminary findings had been compiled into folders marked with classification stamps that restricted their audience to fewer than 50 individuals nationwide. The T-72 secrets were beginning to yield, but the implications of those secrets would prove far more devastating than anyone in that classified facility could yet imagine. What they had discovered wasn't just a tank's weakness, it was a window into the fundamental compromises that defined Soviet military power, trade-offs between capability and survivability that would echo across battlefields for decades to come. The Soviet engine block sat elevated on a hydraulic examination platform, surrounded by measurement instruments whose digital readouts cast green light across faces drawn with concentration and growing disbelief. Dr. Garrison's team had sectioned components with diamond-tipped cutting tools, revealing internal structures that contradicted every principle taught in Western engineering schools, designs that seemed to embrace contradiction as philosophy rather than flaw. The casting showed porosity that would have resulted in immediate rejection at any American foundry, yet these same imperfect components had endured conditions that destroyed precision-manufactured Western alternatives through sheer, brutish over-engineering. Lieutenant Commander James McKittrick, whose Naval Academy education had emphasized elegance in mechanical design, stood transfixed by a cooling system whose inefficiency was so profound it seemed almost intentional, as though Soviet engineers had calculated the minimum functionality required for battlefield conditions and refused to waste resources exceeding that threshold. Garrison photographed weld beads that wandered across joints like drunken signatures, her camera's shutter clicking in rhythmic punctuation to observations she dictated into a tape recorder whose magnetic tape would be stored in vaults designed to survive nuclear attack. The transmission assembly told stories of manufacturing facilities operating under constraints unimaginable to Western industries, gear teeth showing wear patterns that suggested inconsistent metallurgical properties within single components. Major Robert Chen, who had spent 3 years analyzing Soviet industrial capacity from satellite imagery and defector testimonies, recognized in these physical artifacts the confirmation of theories that had been dismissed as speculation by analysts who couldn't imagine a superpower accepting such apparent crudeness. The gearbox had been designed for replacement rather than repair, its modular construction allowing battlefield mechanics with minimal training to swap entire assemblies in conditions where American crews would still be diagnosing failure points. This wasn't inferior engineering, Chen realized with uncomfortable clarity. It was engineering serving different masters, answering to doctrines shaped by historical catastrophes that had killed 20 million Soviet citizens within living memory. The tracks bore sand embedded so deeply into their metal that laboratory analysis could identify the specific desert region where this machine had operated, grain composition telling geographic stories that complemented intelligence reports filed from stations operating under diplomatic cover across the Middle East. Colonel Thornton observed his team's growing comprehension with satisfaction, tempered by awareness that understanding Soviet design philosophy brought them no closer to the central mystery that had justified this entire operation. The question remained suspended above the disassembled components, like radiation hanging invisible in contaminated air. Why did these functional, battle-tested machines explode with such catastrophic violence when penetrated? Western tanks absorbed hits that disabled them, killed crew members through spalling and overpressure, but they didn't transform into bombs with the regularity reported from multiple combat zones. Garrison's fingers moved across the autoloader mounting rails with surgical precision, tracing paths that ammunition would follow from storage to breach, her movements slowing as recognition began crystallizing into hypothesis. The other engineers noticed her stillness, that particular quality of immobility that signified breakthrough rather than confusion, and conversation died as attention focused on the woman, whose silence had become more eloquent than any briefing. The overhead lights hummed with electrical constancy as Garrison finally spoke, her voice carrying across the workshop with the flat affect of someone delivering diagnosis on a terminal patient whose condition had just become tragically clear. She didn't look up from the components, couldn't tear her gaze from the mechanical logic that had seemed merely crude moments before, but now revealed itself as fundamentally, catastrophically flawed in ways that turned every crew into potential casualties of their own ammunition. The arrangement of storage compartments, the placement of propellant charges relative to crew positions, the absence of barriers that Western designers considered essential. These weren't oversights or acceptable compromises, they were decisions that prioritized different variables in calculations where human life held coefficients determined by ideological rather than humanitarian mathematics. McKittrick moved closer, following her pointing finger as she traced hypothetical penetration paths, showing how any breach of the fighting compartment would almost certainly ignite propellant stored in configurations that guaranteed cascading detonation rather than contained fire. The manila folders arrived in sequential deliveries throughout that autumn afternoon, each classified courier, adding documents to stacks that transformed Dr. Garrison's pristine examination notes into something resembling a forensic pathologist's case files on an epidemic. The reports originated from different intelligence sources operating under separate chains of command: CIA field officers embedded with Jordanian armor units, Mossad liaisons sharing sanitized assessments, British SAS advisors who'd walked Syrian battlefields counting wreckage, yet they described identical phenomena with the unsettling consistency of witnesses reporting natural disasters rather than combat outcomes. Garrison read testimonies from tank commanders who'd watched neighboring T-72s detonate with violence that exceeded anything in their experience. Hulls lifting completely off chassis as turrets launched skyward in trajectories that seemed to defy the physics of conventional ammunition detonation. The photographic evidence showed destruction so complete that accident investigators initially suspected secondary explosions from external sources, unable to accept that standard anti-tank rounds could produce blast patterns associated with aerial bombardment. Major Chen spread battlefield photographs across analysis tables with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence from mass casualty events, each image documenting machines transformed into abstract sculptures of torn metal and blast. Shadows. The turrets had landed dozens of meters from their chassis, propelled by internal explosions, generating pressures that ripped welded seams apart like paper envelopes. Survivor accounts described phenomena that sounded more like industrial accidents than combat damage. Crews who'd escaped through commander hatches in the seconds before. Catastrophic detonation. Their testimonies speaking of sounds like freight trains rushing through confined spaces. The distinctive whoosh of propellant ignition spreading faster than human reaction time allowed. Western tanks hit by identical munitions showed penetration damage, crew casualties from spalling and concussive force, but they remained. Structurally intact, their ammunition stored in configurations that prevented the cascading failures documented in these reports. Lieutenant Commander McKittrick cross-referenced engagement data with ammunition types, searching for patterns that might explain why some T-72s survived multiple hits, while others detonated from single. Penetrations that shouldn't have reached critical components. The variable seemed arbitrary until Garrison pointed out what military analysts had missed. The catastrophic failures correlated not with hit location precision, but with whether penetrating rounds breached the crew compartment where ammunition sat exposed in carousels designed for autoloader efficiency rather than blast containment. Soviet engineers had eliminated the human loader, gaining precious seconds in firing cycles, but they'd positioned propellant charges in arrangements that turned the fighting compartment itself into a potential bomb awaiting sufficient ignition energy. Colonel Thornton stood before the evidence wall, where photographs documented dozens of destroyed T-72s, their turrets scattered across desert landscapes like monuments to engineering decisions made in distant design bureaus by men who'd never faced the consequences of their calculations. The pattern was undeniable now, visible in the repetition of identical blast signatures across different conflicts and theaters. These machines weren't being destroyed by enemy action alone. They were destroying themselves, their own ammunition storage design guaranteeing crew deaths even from hits that Western tanks would classify as survivable damage, a fatal flaw built into every vehicle rolling off Soviet production lines. Dr. Garrison positioned the technical schematics beneath halogen examination lights, his fingers tracing the cross-sectional drawings that revealed the T-72's internal geography with the precision of anatomical charts mapping human vulnerability. The autoloader mechanism sat in the turret base like a mechanical heart, its carousel arrangement holding 22 rounds in a circular configuration that prioritized firing speed over every other consideration. Each propellant charge separated from its projectile in a design philosophy that Western engineers found simultaneously brilliant and horrifying. The ammunition storage extended below the turret ring into the crew compartment itself, surrounding the gunner and commander in a wraparound configuration that eliminated wasted space but positioned volatile materials within arm's reach of human bodies, transforming the fighting compartment into what ballistics experts would classify as a confined explosive environment, requiring only sufficient ignition energy to initiate catastrophic failure. Major Chen stood beside him, her expression hardening as understanding crystallized into the terrible recognition of intentional compromise. Soviet designers having calculated crew survivability as an acceptable sacrifice for the operational advantages of rapid-fire capability and reduced vehicle profile. The metallurgical analysis revealed construction decisions that explained the violence documented in battlefield photographs. The ammunition carousel, lacking any blast containment architecture beyond thin steel partitions that offered organizational separation without protective function. Western tanks stored their main gun rounds in isolated compartments fitted with blowout panels designed to channel explosion force away from crew spaces, sacrificing ammunition in exchange for human survival. But the T-72's configuration contained no such safety mechanisms, its design treating the crew compartment as unified space where efficiency trumped protection. Lieutenant Commander McKittrick examined the propellant composition reports, noting that Soviet charges burned hotter and faster than NATO equivalents, optimized for muzzle velocity but generating pressures that demanded robust containment. The carousel storage design, fundamentally couldn't provide once enemy rounds breached the fighting compartment's interior volume. Colonel Thornton requested demonstration models constructed from plexiglass and metal framework, needing visual confirmation of what technical drawings suggested about blast propagation pathways through the T-72's internal architecture. The transparent mock-up revealed the cascading failure sequence with brutal clarity. A single, penetrating round, entering the crew compartment, would spray molten copper particles across exposed propellant charges, igniting one round that instantly spread to adjacent ammunition in a chain reaction measured in milliseconds rather than seconds. The confined space amplifying pressure waves until structural welds failed and the turret separated from its mounting ring with explosive force, equivalent to several hundred kilograms of high explosives detonating simultaneously. The engineers stood silently around the demonstration model, understanding finally why battlefield photographs showed such complete destruction, why survivor accounts described sounds like industrial explosions, why recovery teams found crew remains that testified to death arriving faster than human nervous systems could register pain. Dr. Garrison closed the technical files with movements that suggested completion of autopsies rather than engineering analysis. The fatal flaw now documented with precision that would inform Western military doctrine for decades beyond this Cold War moment. The T-72 wasn't merely vulnerable to catastrophic explosion, it was designed in ways that guaranteed such outcomes whenever enemy fire breached its armor. A mechanical death sentence built into every vehicle carrying crews who trusted their machine to protect them as they'd been trained to believe it would. The intelligence files arrived in locked courier cases, stamped with Cyrillic classifications, documents extracted through methods the analysts never discussed, but which left coffee-stained folders bearing the bureaucratic fingerprints of ministries that no longer existed in their original forms. Dr. Garrison spread the translated reports across the conference, table-like archaeological fragments recovered from a civilization whose internal logic demanded careful reconstruction, each memorandum revealing the impossible constraints Soviet tank designers faced in the decade following the Second World War, when Stalin's industrial planners demanded modern armor from a manufacturing base still recovering from scorched earth devastation. The earliest design proposals showed engineers pleading for crew safety features that Western counterparts considered standard equipment, their technical arguments overruled by production commissars who measured success in units delivered rather than soldiers protected, the bureaucratic correspondence documenting a design process where strategic requirements crushed individual judgment beneath the weight of state priorities that permitted no deviation. Major Chen examined procurement records showing Soviet aluminum production allocated primarily to aircraft manufacturing, leaving tank designers scrambling for materials that forced compromises between armor, thickness and vehicle weight, each engineering decision constrained by industrial realities that Western manufacturers never confronted with comparable severity. The autoloader mechanism emerged from these limitations as a solution to multiple problems simultaneously. Eliminating the human loader reduced crew size from 4 to 3, shrinking turret dimensions that required less armor plate while increasing ammunition capacity in the saved space, a cascading series of advantages that seemed brilliant until combat revealed the catastrophic vulnerability hidden within such aggressive optimization. Lieutenant Commander McKittrick traced the design evolution through technical revisions, spanning 2 decades, watching safety concerns appear in marginalia notes and engineer complaints that vanished in final production specifications. The documentary evidence revealing designers who understood the risks but operated within a system that prioritized quantity over protection. Colonel Thornton requested comparative analysis of Soviet military doctrine, understanding now that the T-72's fatal flaws weren't accidental oversights, but intentional design choices reflecting strategic assumptions about future warfare in Central Europe. Soviet planners envisioned massive armored thrusts where tanks advanced in overwhelming numbers, accepting casualty rates that NATO commanders would consider catastrophic failures, their operational mathematics calculating that losing 30% of attacking forces remained acceptable if the remaining 70% achieved breakthrough objectives that Western defenses couldn't contain. The engine block sitting in the examination facility represented this brutal calculus. Made mechanical, Soviet pragmatism transformed into steel and explosive vulnerability. The engineers understood finally that they weren't analyzing defective equipment, but rather examining a different civilization's answer to the same tactical problems, solutions shaped by historical trauma and resource scarcity that produced machines reflecting the harsh realities of the system that created them. The classified briefing room transformed into a strategic planning laboratory within 72 hours of the discovery, Pentagon analysts summoning design teams from Chrysler Defense and General Dynamics to review findings that would fundamentally reshape American armored doctrine for the next generation of battlefield vehicles. Colonel Thornton presented the Soviet vulnerabilities with clinical precision, his pointer tracking the fatal ammunition placement as defense contractors filled yellow legal pads with sketches that inverted Soviet compromises into Western advantages, their pencils moving with the urgency of men who understood that battlefield superiority measured in milliseconds could determine crew survival when shells penetrated steel. The engineers absorbed lessons paid for with lives lost in Middle Eastern deserts, their questions probing every technical detail as they mentally redesigned turret configurations that would separate crew compartments from ammunition, storage through armored barriers thick enough to contain catastrophic explosions. General Patterson authorized immediate design modifications to the M1 Abrams still in development, directing teams to incorporate isolated ammunition compartments with blowout panels that would vent detonations upward rather than inward, transforming Soviet failures into American protection through engineering solutions that prioritize keeping soldiers alive. The technical specifications evolved across weeks of intensive collaboration, defense contractors competing to implement safety features that Soviet designers had requested and been denied by production commissars 3 decades earlier. Chrysler engineers developed hydraulic blast doors separating the crew compartment from ammunition storage, their prototype designs incorporating sensors that would seal barriers automatically when penetration was detected, milliseconds of mechanical response, determining whether crews walked away or disappeared in fireballs that consumed everything inside steel coffins. General Dynamics refined blowout panel configurations through controlled detonation tests that shook proving grounds with explosions channeled safely skyward, their cameras capturing slow-motion footage of turret roofs, releasing pressure while crew compartments remained intact, visual proof that Western resources permitted protection Soviet tankers never received. The redesigned compartments added weight and complexity that Soviet manufacturing could never have accommodated, but American industrial capacity absorbed these requirements without compromising production schedules, the contrast illuminating why different systems produced such divergent solutions. NATO headquarters in Brussels received the tactical implications within classified briefings that traveled through diplomatic pouches to alliance capitals still calculating survival odds in Central European warfare scenarios. Military planners revised engagement doctrines knowing Soviet armor carried vulnerability that precise targeting could exploit, their strategic assessments shifting from defensive desperation toward calculated confidence that superior Western technology might offset Warsaw Pact numerical advantages in tanks massed along the Iron Curtain. The psychological transformation rippled through command structures as officers internalized the revelation that Soviet machines, terrifying in specification documents, carried fatal compromises that accurate intelligence and proper tactics could neutralize through knowledge rather than matching overwhelming numbers with equivalent forces. The M1 Abrams entered service, carrying lessons learned from examining enemies who would never know how completely their secrets had been penetrated. American crews protected by compartmentalized designs that represented the ultimate intelligence victory, translating stolen knowledge into saved lives through engineering solutions that honored the soldiers those machines would carry into whatever conflicts the uncertain future held beyond the Cold War's frozen tensions. The intelligence windfall cascaded through SHAPE headquarters in Mons, with implications that extended far beyond technical specifications. NATO strategists incorporating T-72 vulnerabilities into war plans that anticipated Soviet armored thrusts through the Fulda Gap with mathematical precision previously impossible when facing tanks wrapped in mythology rather than understood weaknesses. Supreme Allied Commanders' planning staff revised defensive deployments, knowing that properly trained gunners targeting specific impact points could potentially neutralize numerical disadvantages that had haunted Western military calculations since the first T-72s appeared in satellite reconnaissance photographs. The psychological transformation proved as valuable as the tactical knowledge, frontline commanders briefing tank crews in West German bases about enemy vulnerabilities that converted abstract fear into concrete targeting solutions, their confidence growing with each classified presentation that stripped away the aura of invincibility surrounding Soviet armor massed beyond checkpoints where two systems faced each other across minefields and barbed wire. Young soldiers absorbed the revelations with visible relief, their questions probing details that transformed desperate last stands into calculated engagements where knowledge compensated for being outnumbered 3-1 by Warsaw Pact divisions, whose equipment carried fatal compromises hidden inside impressive silhouettes. Soviet intelligence services detected the shift through channels that monitored Western military communications and observed NATO exercise patterns, changing to exploit specific tactical vulnerabilities that should have remained secret behind classification barriers impenetrable to capitalist espionage. KGB analysts in Moscow compiled reports noting suspicious precision in how American training scenarios targeted ammunition storage locations. Their assessments delivered to Defense Ministry officials who faced uncomfortable questions about whether design flaws had been compromised through security breaches or defectors who carried technical knowledge westward. The paranoia inherent in Soviet systems intensified as military leadership investigated whether American confidence stemmed from actual intelligence or psychological operations designed to undermine faith in equipment that represented decades of industrial investment and strategic planning. The mutual awareness created strategic instability, more dangerous than ignorance, both sides knowing that the other understood capabilities and limitations that transformed potential conflicts into calculations, measuring crew training against design vulnerabilities across hypothetical battlefields. Pentagon War Games incorporated Soviet awareness of their exposure. Planners accounting for potential design modifications or tactical adaptations that might emerge once Moscow confirmed that secrets had traveled beyond the Iron Curtain through channels that remained frustratingly unidentified despite intensive counterintelligence efforts. The key psychological warfare dimension evolved into elaborate deception operations where both sides maneuvered around knowledge that existed in classified briefing rooms but could never be publicly acknowledged without revealing intelligence sources that remained more valuable than any temporary tactical advantage. The Cold War's final decade proceeded under these shadow calculations. Tank designers and military planners on both continents working with assumptions shaped by secrets that influenced procurement decisions and tactical doctrines, while soldiers trained for conflicts that never materialized beyond exercises, where knowledge of enemy weaknesses remained theoretical rather than tested in actual combat that would have validated or refuted everything the captured engine block had revealed. The fatal flaw discovered within the T-72's engine compartment became a parable for the entire Soviet experiment. Engineers and historians recognizing in those compromised steel plates the same calculus that governed every aspect of life. Behind the Iron Curtain, where human value disappeared beneath production quotas and ideological rigidity, the tank's designers had faced impossible choices within a system that demanded results without providing resources. Their solution trading crew survivability for manufacturing speed in decisions that mirrored how Soviet planners sacrificed generations to industrial targets that looked impressive in Pravda photographs, but concealed human costs tallied in unmarked graves and unspoken compromises. Western analysts studying the captured vehicle saw reflected in its ammunition carousel the same brutal efficiency that characterized collective farms where starvation fueled wheat exports. Gulags where prisoner labor built canals, and apartment blocks where families crowded into concrete boxes while leadership dachas sprawled across forested estates outside Moscow's Ring Road. The mechanical choices became philosophical revelations about societies that measured success differently. One system prioritizing the individual soldier's survival through expensive protected compartments, while the other calculated that replacement crews cost less than redesigned storage systems, in equations where people remained the most expendable variable. The lessons extracted from that examination chamber influenced tank development for decades. Beyond the Cold War's conclusion, American M1, Abrams and British Challenger designs incorporating blowout panels and separated ammunition compartments that trace their lineage directly to those months spent documenting Soviet compromises under fluorescent lights in classified facilities. Israeli engineers absorbed the intelligence after their Merkava tanks faced T-72s in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, their subsequent designs prioritizing crew survivability with religious intensity born from combat experience that validated everything the technical analysis had predicted about catastrophic ammunition detonations. The knowledge proliferated through Allied networks as Warsaw Pact nations transitioned toward NATO membership. Their officers attending briefings where former enemies explained why the tanks they'd trained on for careers carried design flaws that commanders had suspected but never confirmed until classification barriers dissolved with the Soviet Union itself. Modern battlefields from Iraq to Ukraine demonstrated the enduring relevance of those discoveries made decades earlier. Television audiences worldwide watching turrets launched skyward by internal explosions that vindicated every conclusion American engineers had documented in reports stamped with security classifications now declassified by time and geopolitical transformation. The distinctive catastrophic failures became grimly recognizable, signatures of Soviet-era design philosophy encountering modern anti-tank weapons. Each explosion a testament to compromises made in distant factories where engineers worked within constraints that prioritized production numbers over the young men who would eventually occupy crew positions inside machines, built to satisfy quotas rather than protect lives. Contemporary tank designers reference the T-72 analysis as foundational text in courses, teaching that engineering decisions carry moral dimensions extending beyond technical specifications into questions about what societies owe soldiers sent into combat inside vehicles that reflect national values through every welded seam and design choice. The captured engine block ultimately revealed truths exceeding its metallurgical composition, its examination uncovering not just mechanical vulnerabilities, but philosophical contradictions within a system that collapsed under accumulated weight of 10,000 similar compromises, where ideology overruled human considerations until the entire structure became unsustainable. Those engineers who first documented the fatal flaw participated unknowingly in archaeology of empire decline, their technical reports serving as autopsy findings for a superpower whose demise was already encoded in design decisions that valued production over people, secrecy over safety, and ideological purity over engineering, honesty that might have saved countless crews incinerated inside tanks built to impress parade spectators rather than protect the young men, steering them toward battlefields where compromises became consequences measured in shattered families and unmarked graves, stretching across decades of Cold War confrontation that never quite ignited into the global conflagration. Both sides spent fortunes preparing to fight. What other Cold War secrets changed the course of military history? Subscribe to uncover the classified stories that shaped our world.